Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and in this one I'm going to go over my ninth and final round game from the Chess Max Academy GM Invitational. Now before I get into this game and provide some of the context behind it, I just wanted to briefly mention, essentially what had happened over the past few weeks, because it's actually been 2 weeks since I put out a video. And I don't know if everyone actually gotten a chance to see my YouTube community post, because I actually posted on my channel that my computer basically ran out of space. So essentially I've been doing videos for so long now that there was just too much on my computer to maintain, and I actually recorded a video and it had actually crashed. So this is actually a redo of a video it already done, unfortunately, but it is what it is. And then another thing that happened that was kind of annoying was that certain keys on my laptop's keyboard weren't actually working. So I went to the store, checked it out. They were saying that like the motherboard was just failing essentially, and that my laptop is basically gonna die eventually. It's just too old, and that I probably need to purchase another one. But I kind of was stubbornly against purchasing a new one just yet, because I have so many other files on this computer that I just didn't want to move just yet, even though I did now purchase an external hard drive. So I am sticking with the laptop that I have been using for the past 2 years or so, but I actually bought a wireless keyboard to kind of replace the one that's actually on the laptop. So that was a little bit frustrating as well. And then last but not least, I actually played a tournament in Charlotte, North Carolina, which, as you know, has been a frequent trip for me for these closed Norm Invitationals. It actually was a tournament last week, and I had gotten my external hard drive, but I still was kind of dealing with some of these laptop issues, and quite frankly, I've always gone back and forth over whether to record videos while I'm actually playing in a tournament, because to be honest, it can be a really, really huge distraction. So thus far, what I've done is I've actually recorded a video every day. I've been doing videos every single day so that you have quality content. But I do go back and forth over whether or not I should stop doing videos while I playing the tournament, just so I can fully focus on that. So I am going to still try to keep the one a day pace, but if for some reason you notice that maybe I'm not keeping that pace, it may very well be because I made that decision to focus 100% on the tournament and ultimately on becoming a Grandmaster, right? Because I don't want to be doing the Road to Grandmaster series forever. So so without further ado, let me get back to the game. So if you had seen the round 7 and round 8 videos for this tournament, you know that it actually won 2 in a row now. And so going into the last round, I was thrilled just to be in a position where I was only on -1, because a few rounds ago it was looking like a total disaster, and now at least I had recovered a little bit. So typically in the last round, a lot of people just want to, close out with the score that they have, finish with a draw, and just, a lot of, short draws actually happen in the last round of events. But I was feeling very, very ambitious because of my recent game. So I was really wanting to try and get all the way back to even, and I kind of made this decision to play this game regardless of whether my opponent offered me a draw or not. So my opponent in this one was International Master Farai Mandizha, and he has been a staple in American chess for probably over 10 years now, pretty much like 10 to 15 years. I can recall a game he played at the World Open a long time ago where he beat a young Hikaru Nakamura, who was already about, not quite 2,700, but high 2,600 player. And that kind of was marked as a rival, and he's been a real staple on the chess scene since. He coaches, I believe, at Hunter part-time or maybe full-time. And he's also been someone, there aren't a lot of, black chess players out there that, are of his level. So he's always someone that, you just admire from afar, just because, I'm, being a fellow black chess player, there aren't many of us out here. So there's definitely a mutual respect, I think, between us. So anyways, I know he's a sharp player, and it would be an interesting test. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I was white, and I opened with d4. And Farai in the past used to play the Nimzo Indian quite a bit, but I knew in the last few years he'd been trotting out the King's Indian. So after knight f6 and c4, I kind of expected the King's Indian, and fortunately I guessed correctly, because after g6, g3, this was my move opting for the fianchetto variation. Bishop g7, bishop g2, castles, knight c3, and then d6 was played. And of course this move d6 is one of the key markers of the King's Indian, because you could go to d5 and play a Grunfeld, but that would be a different type of structure. Now I should say that the last chance that that black actually had to make it a Grunfeld is before my knight goes to c3, because once it goes to c3, with my fianchettoed bishop already on the square, there's just too much pressure on d5. So this was the last chance, and he decided to castle, and then we got knight c3 and d6. And the fianchetto variation has been an infrequent guest in my repertoire. I think one of the things that is nice about it is it takes on a more positional feel. So instead of the normal King's Indian lines where there's pretty much a race going on, where white is trying to push these pawns on the queen side and break through like that, and black's tending to push on the king side and get some king side attack. These lines don't really feature so much of a race as more of a positional struggle that I thought would be a good way to nullify Farai's dynamic play, because he's a very dynamic player. But I must say there's some features of this position have always kind of baffled me, in that in a lot of the lines, the black dark squared bishop actually has the long diagonal and is not obstructed by its own pawn, whereas white, in an attempt to take space, typically has to play e4 and shut down their own light squared bishop. So I've always thought that this position really is quite tricky to play, because in the long term, white has the space advantage and just a nice slight advantage to play with. But in the short term, I always thought that black had pretty good dynamic chances with the bishop on the long diagonal. And we'll see what I'm talking about in a moment. So anyways, after d6, I went knight f3, and then knight bd7 was played, and this is normal, just trying to prepare the e5 move. And now I castled e5, and now here e4 becomes a threat pretty soon. So not right now, because I have knight g5. Not knight h5, knight g5. So typically here they play e4, and that's what I did. And after e takes d4, knight takes d4, we have this position that I was talking about, where I have this almost Maroczy bind-like structure with my pawns on c4 and e4, really restraining black's pawn breaks. But you can see my bishop is hemmed in behind the e4 pawn, whereas black's dark square bishop is not really obstructed by a pawn on the diagonal. So a lot of times there are some ways that the knight can come unleashed, and the bishop becomes a very ferocious piece. So just something to be wary of in the short term. But anyways, after knight takes d4, black went rook e8, and this is I don't think it's the most common move, but it's very, very playable. So I think typically it's some combination of rook e8 or a5. This new mouse maybe is making my arrows a little bit weird, but I know a6 and a5 is an option as well. Rook e8 is also a thematic move. Sometimes even c6 is played. The general gist is just to put a little bit more pressure on e4 and give white something to worry about there, because this knight has the potential to come to c5 and be a third attacker on that pawn. I played the move bishop e3, and I think this is one of the key features of the fact that rook e8 was played and not another move, is that I actually have the luxury of doing this. Now, if there was a move like, I don't know, let's say if knight c5 was played instead of rook e8, I might be a little bit more reluctant to play bishop e3, because there might be knight g4 ideas in some lines. So typically, I believe usually the move knight c5 is played, and then white goes actually h3 to cover the g4 square. But because the move rook e8 was played, note that knight g4 is not really possible, because my queen is actually covering the g4 square. So that's why I played the move bishop e3. And what this allows me to do is it gives me the option of playing this position without h3, which I thought was an actually pretty interesting nuance. Because now that black played the move a6, I actually wasn't really thinking about playing f3 at all. And one example of that is, let's say black plays the move knight c5 here. Well, the e4 pawn is hit multiple times, and now I can play the move f3. And the nice thing about it is my bishop is actually pretty well placed on this diagonal, so I don't feel as wary of weakening the diagonal with this pawn move f3, because their queen b6s have way less venom, because my bishop is already covering the king on g1. So a lot of times you might feel like, not the best way to play this f3 move, but here I thought it was quite decent. So anyways, a6 was played instead, and this move is actually, quite legitimate. It actually introduces two different ideas. One thing that it does, it actually covers the b5 square. So in a lot of lines, a knight would actually love to land on b5, and ultimately just keep an eye on the c7 pawn, but also discourage the c pawn from even moving to c6, because then d6 would be hanging. So I've actually played a structure similar to this with black, where I've played the move a5 in such positions. And the problem with this move is actually knight db5, and it's just these pawns in particular, c7 and d6, just become a total headache for black to contend with. So that's pretty much why I think a6 is a good move. The other thing it does is, in some lines, it actually introduces the move c5. Now you might say c5 is extremely weakening, because the d6 pawn then becomes permanently backward. But, in some positions, black can get away with it if he gets active play on the queen side. So after a6, I played the move h3 now, shifting gears and deciding to now protect the g4 square with the h pawn instead of the f pawn, because I thought that now that a6 and maybe even c5 was on the cards, and potentially even an opening of the entire queen side with c5 and b5, I thought it would make sense that my bishop on g2 would have a chance to play on the long diagonal, and so I didn't want to shut it down with f3. After h3, black played the move rook b8, and I was quite pleased that I actually played h3 now, because it was quite clear that black was trying to prepare this b5 move. Now, it's not something you can get off right away, because the c6 square is extremely sensitive, and in fact, if you push the b pawn, knight c6 not only forks the rook and queen, it actually just traps the queen. So obviously the c6 square is sensitive, but black can slowly prepare this with c5 and b5. So now I actually decided to play the move a4, and the reason I did this was just to restrain the b5 break. I thought that made, a decent amount of sense. I could allow it, but I just didn't love the counterplay that black gets, and I thought that this was a reasonable way to just restrain it. Now, a lot of times when you play this a4 move in such structures, you have to be a little bit concerned about black playing a5, and ultimately the issue here is that the b4 square is kind of weak, and if the knight can somehow land on b4, it's a really nice outpost. But in my estimation, I decided that, one weak square is not enough to, diminish my spatial advantage. And the other thing that I thought about was that now that I'd have the b5 square once again for my knights, it would mean that I'd be able to put real pressure on black's queenside pawn. So I thought that weakening b4 was not the end of the world. The other thing is that a knight coming to b4 would actually take quite some time. Like knight c5, a6, b4, that's 3 moves to get that knight to b4. And who's to say that, it's really doing all that much besides looking good? Because if I put my queen on d2, I keep it 2 diagonals away from the b4 square, and it's not so clear what the knight can do eyeing d3 or even c2 without further help. So I thought, knight b4 is maybe not the end of the world. So after a4, instead, Farai went for the move knight e5, I think correctly assessing that a5 was not really worth it. And now I played the move b3, just covering the c4 square. And now he played the move c5. And this is, again, the really thematic idea behind, the past few moves that Farai has played with a6 and rook b8 was to prepare for this c5 break. But believe it or not, it's actually not very good. And it has a very, very nice refutation that I'll show in just a moment. So after c5, the question is where to put the knight. I have, a few different options, c2, e2, f3. I thought that knight de2 was the best, and the reason for that is the knight actually covers itself, right? The knights protect each other. The knight on c3 and the one on e2 are now protected. And in some lines, there might be an option for this knight to relocate to d5, whereas on c2, there was not really much of a future, I thought. So I thought knight e2 made sense. And now here, knight c6 was played, and you can see this knight all of a sudden is sort of eyeing some of the dark squares on my queen side, the backward b3 pawn and the b4 square. But even with this like potential weakness on the queen side, white is actually significantly better, and it has to do a lot with my next move. And the move, quite remarkably, is actually rook a2. And this move has actually been played once before when I checked the database, but I actually thought it was a novelty because I'd actually prepared this move, and not particularly for this game, but I knew it to be an idea in the structure. And the idea is really wonderful. The point is that with rook a2, you put the rook off of the diagonal that the bishop is bearing down on. And then the other concept is that you're actually trying to shift it over to d2 from where it can really challenge the d6 pawn. And you can see that this d6 pawn is already backward and weak. And if the d6 pawn drops, then there's the potential for the c5 pawn to drop as well. And then the structure pretty much collapses. And so rook a2 is a really, really strong move that I think Farai, basically probably hadn't seen before, wasn't aware of, because it really calls into question this entire setup. Now, it is a King's Indian, and the King's Indian is extremely tricky. I mean, even if you have a nice position, who's to say you're supposed to win the game? Because, white is better in almost every line of the King's Indian, but the point is that black has very good counterattacking chances. And here, Farai played the move queen b6. And the idea is just to kind of jettison the d6 pawn and seek counterplay elsewhere. Now, you might say, well, why don't you take on d6? Why are you why don't you do something else? Well, I was a little bit wary of taking on d6. I think I can't recall off the top of my head why I was actually so worried, because it looks quite playable now. But I think I didn't love the positions with queen takes b3 essentially, and I didn't like that. I might be picking off a pawn on c5, maybe I'm winning a pawn, but I thought that black would be very, very active. And one line I think might illustrate that is queen takes b3, queen takes d6, queen takes d3. If I take on c5, well, it just looks a little bit suspect here, in my opinion. There might be bishop f8 ideas. Maybe there's knight d7 ideas. I just don't like my pieces being chased around right now, and I've definitely lost a little bit of coordination. So I didn't want to get too greedy and grab that pawn. And instead, I decided to play the move rook d2, which is actually the strongest move in the position and really, really effective, because now my queen actually protects the b3 pawn still, and I'm planning to take on d6 with my rook. Now, black is in a world of trouble here, and Farai's next move did not really solve matters. He played the move bishop f8, and this move actually is not very good, and already here white actually has a winning position. But the challenge is that there were so many attractive options in this position that I wasn't sure which one to go for. And in my opinion, even though my next move is actually evaluated as winning by the computer, I already believe it was a step in the wrong direction, simply because it's kind of difficult to carry out the moves after the next move. So why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out how white should try to prosecute this advantage. Again, the last move that black played was bishop f8. So how does white proceed from here? All right, hopefully you paused the video and got a chance to kind of evaluate what white should do. Now, the move that I played actually is a winning move, and a move that the computer evaluates as good. I played the move bishop g5, but the move that I thought on for like pretty much 30 minutes, I really thought on this position for way too long, actually. And the move that I really wanted to play was actually rook takes d6. And this is a move, again, that is not the number one choice of the computer. Bishop g5, the move I played, is actually the best choice, the number one choice. But I think this move is just a lot better and pretty much would end the game relatively quickly. And part of the reason is once this dark square bishop comes off the board, Black really has a hard time holding the position together because he really lacks a lot of space, and the bishop gives him those dynamic chances in the center. So after rook takes d6, if you take the exchange and queen takes, I already have a pawn for the exchange, and you can see here that there are some things hanging. The c5 pawn is hanging, the knight on f6 is hanging, and in the midst of the dark square bishop being off the board, all of a sudden the dark squares around the black king are really, really sensitive. And so the position is quite simply lost because Black really can't maintain coverage in the center and on the king side. And so after a move like knight d7, just trying to defend the c5 pawn and the knight on f6, now I have rook b1, and I'm defending my b3 pawn, and I'm reinforcing the threat of knight d5. And Black is just totally tied up. The knight on c6 is really not in a good place right now, can barely move. The knight on d7 can't move either. The bishop on c8 is still at home, and it's just a really, really ugly position. Note that a move like knight d4, trying to get the queens off the board, tactically doesn't really help, because after queen takes b6, even though you have knight takes e2 check intermediate move, knight takes e2, and knight takes b6, well, after bishop takes c5, white now has 2 pawns for the exchange, so the material's technically equal, and the material doesn't tell the whole story, because after knight d7 and let's say bishop d6, Black just has a massive disadvantage, and white's just simply winning because the pawn mass will be able to scurry up the board. This rook on a8 is going to be really terrible once this diagonal opens up as well, and white just has too much space on both sides of the board for Black to really do anything. And rooks really like open files, and it's hard to imagine a really effective open file for these rooks to play on anytime soon. So it's just a positional crush, if you will. So really this would have been way better just to give up the exchange and just pretty much squeeze Black. And I actually mentioned this to Farai after the game, and he actually said that after rook takes d6, he was not going to take the rook. He was going to play a move like bishop e6. And I think, of course, this only made me a little bit more annoyed that I didn't do it, but I think it just highlights just how bad the position is. Because if you're just going to give up a pawn pretty much for nothing, and I still have all these trumps in the center, white's got to be a lot better. So, kind of a missed opportunity for me, given that he wasn't even going to take, but it is what it is. Instead, I play the move bishop g5, which seems really great because I'm attacking the knight, and if it moves, I get the knight on the d5 square. And so knight d7 was played, and here I actually played knight d5, and I thought, wow, this is some position because Black's pieces in the past few moves have gone backward. The bishop went to f8, this knight went to d7, and my pieces have gone forward, and I still have this massive space advantage. But the thing about, this particular sequence is that Black is actually going to get a little bit of counterplay. And the reason for that is once this queen moves, which of course it did to a5, now Black is constantly, teasing out the move b5. And I don't have any kind of direct shots at the Black king right now. I'm going to need to add more fuel to the fire. And that's kind of going to require an f4 and f5 push. And that push is going to be very double-edged because all of a sudden it almost becomes a race where white is kind of playing on the king side to give mate, and Black is playing on the queen side to get some of the, counterplay and chances on that side of the board. And in many respects, it's almost like the roles in the King's Indian are kind of reversed, where, normally it's white that's playing on the queen side and Black's trying to play mate on the king side, but it's just kind of, turned on its head. And this kind of race, quite frankly, is it just adds a little bit more risk to the position for me, because the other position where I'm just giving up the exchange and playing positionally, there's zero risk that anything can go wrong because I have everything under control on both sides of the board. So that's really the issue here, is that even though white is significantly better, it requires a level of precision that the other lines simply did not require. So yeah, that's pretty much the problem. Now, the other thing I should say is that knight d5, according to the computer, is not even the most effective move. And I think that's another, thing that kind of, makes this position quite strange, because you'd think, oh, knight d5 attacks the queen, but it does put it on a better square. And so instead, f4 is actually much stronger. And the point is, now black's going to go queen a5 anyway to try and try and free up the game and think about playing for b5. And now the best move is actually f5. And the point is that even though I'm giving up these, the e5 square to black's knights, I'm, trying to open up this f-file and play for mate. And another important feature is that with my knight on c3, b5 is actually not possible yet. And so that's actually why the knight actually is worth staying on c3 for a little bit, because I kind of restrained b5, but I didn't really realize that. So anyways, I did go knight d5, queen a5, and now I went for f4. But you can see here that, again, it's going to be a little bit of a race, because black is going to get in b5. Instead of playing f4, the better move was bishop f6. And I must say I did see this move, but I did not see the following idea, because I knew here that knight takes f6 is obviously impossible because I pick up the rook on e8 after recapturing. But the really wonderful concept with bishop f6 is that if black plays b5 now, I can actually take a few times, and black's actually just lost, because if you play queen takes b5, there's knight c7, just picking up the rook on e8. And if you go rook takes b5, there's actually knight ec3, with the idea that if the rook goes back, rook a2 actually traps the queen. The queen has no squares on the b file to go to. Of course, the a file is taken, and then the remaining squares are covered by my minor pieces. And so very, very unusual situation where the queen is just kind of caught on the side of the board, and that's why bishop f6 is actually so effective, is because it's honestly a little bit of prophylaxis against b5. Now, in this line, black can play knight b4, but even here, now there's bishop c3, and this is another key element of the line, is that this pin is extremely annoying to deal with for black. And the other issue is that, again, if you take on b5 with the queen, there's knight c7. And so white maintains a really, really massive advantage and restrains the b5 move. Instead, I went f4, and now black went bishop g7. And this is actually a pretty, cool move, because now that d6 is not really under fire, there's no reason for the bishop to be on f8, so it's just going to come back and play on this diagonal again. And the other thing it does, it's very provocative, because it kind of invites me to push my pawn further. And so after bishop g7, I played the move f5, trying to get this thing going, get it rolling on the king side. But again, this is not the most precise move. And again, I'm still a lot better. There's no doubt about that. I have the space advantage. I do have a monster knight on d5, but it's just not the most precise, and it gives black a lot of chances. Instead, again, a subtle move was required that actually restrains b5, and the move is actually knight c1. And remarkably, the point is that if b5, after a takes b5 and a takes b5, rook a2 actually traps the queen once again, because my minor pieces are controlling the squares off of the a file. And so, again, you can just see that it was really required for me to push on the king side, but also restrain this b5 break, and I just wasn't able to do that, because I played f5, and now black played b5, and you can see it's just pretty much a mess. It's not clear at all, how white is going to, prosecute this position in the next few moves. And black is really getting, a lot of activity now, which was not the case in the exchange sacrifice line. So that's really why I'm being so critical of my decision making here, because it's really not my style to play this way either. I am trying to improve my tactical ability, and I have shown at various junctures some tactical skill, but playing this type of double-edged chess where I'm allowing my opponent unnecessary chances, I don't think is very smart. And so that's why I'm so critical here. So anyways, after b5, I decided to play f6 now and kind of lock the bishop out of the game. But this move was actually, again, a mistake. Instead, a takes b5 was more effective. And the point is that after taking on b5 a few times, rook takes b5 is forced because of the knight c7 fork. I now have the move king h2, and the point is that king h2 is a really nice prophylaxis before I press onward on the king side. And after a move like rook b8, I now could play knight ef4, and all of a sudden I'm probably going to shift my rook over to f2 and just have a ton of pieces essentially converging on the king side. And even though my structure on the queen side is, pretty much non-existent, I have one pawn on b3, and it's, not the strongest pawn in the world. Just having all of these pieces in the neighborhood of the black king is going to be extremely dangerous. So that's why it would have been a little bit better to keep this tension on f5, especially considering that black is not going to take on f5 and weaken his king side. So f6 was just a little bit hasty, and actually gives black a little bit of a reprieve, because now he doesn't really have to worry about the f file being opened anytime soon. So you play f6 with the intent that you're going to ultimately, maybe checkmate on the h file, or this pawn f6 is going to be a thorn pawn that supports a mate on g7. But what you realize is that in the short term, it really does give black a lot of chances on the other side of the board, because it really kind of blocks off my direct highways to the king. So anyways, after f6, black played bishop f8, of course, going back to f8. Of course, not bishop h8, because then here the bishop would be in a permanent purgatory. So bishop f8 is better. And now I took on b5 a few times, and after rook takes b5, I played the move knight ec3. And it's a real shame that I didn't catch on to this concept of the queen trap earlier, because essentially the problem here is that after the rook goes back, rook a2 no longer traps the queen, because the f6 pawn has robbed the bishop of the d8 square. So basically after rook b8, I did go rook a2, but then black has queen d8, and all of a sudden he's just managed to sneak away and escape unscathed. So the question is now with the pawn f6, how to proceed, how to actually get my initiative going here, because right now my structure is not very good. I have, for all intents and purposes, I have a weak b3 pawn and a weak e4 pawn, because it's really well blockaded and it's not able to be supported by the f pawn. And even my g3 and h3 pawns are actually not the strongest either. So all my pawns are actually kind of weak. And in front of weak pawns are normally really nice squares. And so you can see here the b4 square is a nice square for black's pieces. The e5 square is a wonderful square for black's pieces. And so black's pieces are going to really spring to life quite quickly. And if I'm not able to play with an attack really, really quickly, I'm probably going to lose the game, because all of a sudden it's black that actually has the long-term trumps in the position. And this is why it's so important to always think about short-term assets and long-term assets, because right now black has the long-term assets with the structural advantages. So that was something big time to think about. I think I basically kind of panicked here, because I realized that black had the long-term assets, and because of that, I actually decided to just get it going right away with the move queen c1. And the idea with queen c1 was to try and trade these bishops and then just give mate on g7. But the problem is it just doesn't work. And it's extremely direct. It's not subtle at all. And I think there were better ways of trying to tee this up without, giving up material, because now you can see the b3 pawn is hanging. One way to do this would just be to go king h2. Just a little bit of prophylaxis to tuck my king to the side. A very Kasparov type of move where, he always tended to play a nice little prophylactic move before going for the kill. And then maybe trying to reroute my rook somewhere, or, basically just hold on to my b3 pawn a little bit longer instead of just giving it up for nothing, because it wasn't necessary to do that. Now, after queen c1, there's really no going back. And the problem for me is actually there are multiple ways that black can defend this bishop h6 idea, so it's just not very good. Black really did not spend a lot of time playing rook takes b3 and picking up that pawn and just saying, show me what you're trying to do. Show me your attack. And now I went for bishop h6 because I was trying to justify my play, but it just doesn't work. Black played the move rook e6, which is a really good move, and it basically does two things. It eyes the f6 pawn a little bit more, just so I have to worry about defending it, and it also allows the queen on d8 to recapture the bishop, so that this queen on c1 can't swoop in to h6 and give mate. And so this whole concept just doesn't work, and because it doesn't work, I'm actually just going to be worse. So after rook e6, I played rook a8, at least trying to get some counterplay on the 8th rank, trying to, pin black's pieces and kind of slow down the process of potentially converging on these outposts on d4 and e5 with the knights. But now black played the move rook b8, and I think that's a really, really excellent move, because basically the concept is, if you're up material, just trade and nullify some of my attacking chances. And so, rook b8 really does that. I took on b8, and then knight d takes b8 was played, and I played the move bishop takes f8, which is just a bad decision, because essentially I'm helping to facilitate trades, and instead I should try and keep the tension because I'm down material. Instead, a better move would have just been h4, and the point is with h4, I introduce h5 as an idea in some positions, trying to open up the h-file, and just trying to get another avenue to the black king. The other concept is that in some lines, bishop h3 might be a nice move, challenging the rook on e6. So it just would have been a better move than bishop takes f8. But I did take on f8, and then after queen takes f8, you can see here that I don't really have a great follow-up, because the important squares, the important dark squares around the king are all well covered. And strategically here, I have a really, really poor pawn structure, because my pawn on e4, again, is blockaded effectively. My bishop on g2 is really hemmed in. And the pawn f6, is really the one strength of my position, but if I can't get any attacking chances on the black king, I'm going to have serious problems. So I played the move knight c7 now, challenging that rook on e6. And then after rook e5, I played the move knight c d5. And I was hoping with the knight so advanced in the position that this could, basically give me some counterplay. But unfortunately here, this is more of an example of superfluous knights, because they're kind of doing similar jobs. This knight on c7 is not really doing so great, and the knight on d5 is already there, so the knight on c7 can't also be there, and so this knight on c7 is kind of just hanging in the wind and not really doing very much. I was hoping that maybe controlling the e8 square would mean something. So maybe with the knights being a little bit pesky here, it'd be difficult for black to move. But Farai did a good job of just playing around these knights. And he played the move bishop e6, which I think is a really, really good decision. Essentially putting the bishop on a decent square, eyeing the knight on d5, just so he has the option of trading it if he wants, and then preparing knight d7 and knight d4. I now play the move knight takes e6, kind of panicking again. And it's another example of a panicked move based upon the circumstances of the position, or what I thought the circumstances were, which were that it didn't seem very pleasant for me, and I thought that I need to do something very concrete. But this, again, is just another trade that helps black consolidate. Instead, knight f4 would have been a little bit more effective, just declining to trade pieces right now. And also, in some lines, entertaining knight takes e6 with the benefit that black would have to take with the f pawn, which would change some things, because all of a sudden maybe the f6 pawn would be more of a factor if I could play f7 check. So, so that knight f4 would have been a little bit better. But after knight e6, rook e6, all of a sudden, I don't have any follow-ups here. Knight e7 is not a move. And this knight on b8 can go to d7, then to e5. And black's getting very, very close to getting that doomsday scenario that I was talking about, where the knights have these really awesome outposts. My bishop is locked in behind this pawn on e4, and I just don't have any counterplay. I finally played the move h4, but it took way too long to do this. And of course, trade two pairs of minor pieces being traded, like two trades later, I play this move. It should have been played with more pieces on the board, because it's going to be very, very hard to attack now. After h4, black played knight d4, and that is already a very serious threat, this knight e2 idea. So I played the move rook f2, defending against this plan, and also entertaining shifting my rook towards the queen side. Instead, the move queen b2 would have been a little bit more effective. The point is that I keep my queen 2 diagonals away from the knight and invade with my queen, on the queen side instead of my rook, because my rook is actually very, very importantly covering the f6 pawn. And so after queen b2, knight c6, knight c7, rook e5, and rook a1, I would have had a little bit more counterplay than the game, although black still is a promising position here. Anyways, after rook f2, knight bc6 was played, and you could just see here how good the knights are right now, given how poor my pawn structure is. And here I actually played what is the losing move, the move rook a2. Unfortunately, this move just doesn't work. My idea was to try and get some counterplay on the back rank in conjunction with knight c7, but the issue is that I'm leaving my king relatively bare, and these knights are very, very well placed to kind of converge on my position. Instead, the better move would have been to play h5. But even in this position, black has a quite playable game. After g takes h5, queen g5 check, and king h8, there's queen takes h5, and it seems like I'm getting somewhere. Like all of a sudden, there's play on the h file. This f6 pawn is still a problem. But after rook e8, black's actually totally fine, because it's very, very difficult to kind of build up the pressure in the position. And, if black trades the queens, like queen g8 and queen g6 or something along those lines, very, very difficult endgame for me, because my pawns are all pretty much targets. And, this bishop on g2 is not very good. So essentially, even after h5, I'm probably still a little bit worse, but at least I get some counterplay, which I've pretty much been desperately seeking the whole game. Instead, after rook a2, black just played the very, very powerful h5, and unfortunately now my counterplay on the king side is pretty much shut down forever, because I never have h5 as a lever anymore. And not only that, but now my g3 pawn is a fixed backward weakness. And so all of a sudden you have an e4 pawn that's backwards and weak, a g3 pawn that's weak, and I have no pawn moves to play, which really, really hurts me, because I can't really build up more pressure in the position. Really, if you think about it, I only have 3 pieces that are playing, and they're the rook, the knight, and the queen, because my bishop on g2 is pretty much a dead piece behind this pawn. And of course, if I move it, let's say to h3, I drop e4. So that just, kind of sums up the position. And then the other thing that's so strong about h5 is it actually gives the king a square in h7. So black no longer has back rank issues because of my pawn on f6. And so basically the combination of those dynamics means that I don't have any counterplay on the black king. If I don't have any counterplay on the black king, I'm just a pawn down with weaknesses. And that's pretty much the issue. I played king h1 now, at least trying to free up my rook to move, because I couldn't even infiltrate just yet with knight c7 and rook a8 because of the move knight e2 check, forking the queen and the king on g1. So yeah, I couldn't even pretend to get off my idea with knight c7 and rook a8 because I'm just not in time. And now, after king h1, black played the very, very well-timed rook e8. And the point is that, well, I could play knight c7, but then the rook goes to b8, and there's just no more counterplay. And so, yeah, I'm just pretty much running out of ideas. I went queen f4 now, at least trying to get my queen, I guess, closer to the black king, but you can see there's no way in because there's all these squares are pretty much covered. And black now went knight e5, and you can see here that these knights are quite simply a vision. They're just totally, totally dominant, and there's really just nothing I can do. Now, I thought knight e5 was a really nice move just aesthetically, too, because you could see that my bishop is completely hemmed in, and it's pretty much just a fat pawn. And, yeah, there's just not much to do. I played the move rook a7, but I actually want to point out that even this move knight e7 check actually really doesn't do anything, because black could go king h7 and just chill and dart away. But even the move rook takes e7 is probably close to winning for black, because these knights are so strong here that even being an exchange down, it's going to be very, very difficult to even try to defend this position having no targets to work with. This king will just step up to g7. Black has incredible dark square control, and at any moment the c-pawn can start running. The knights can converge even more, and it's just a nightmare to play. Pun intended. So just a really good example of how amazing knights can be if they have really good outposts. So that's actually why I went rook a7 and not knight e7 right away, because I feared such an exchange sack. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, after rook a7, black now went rook a8, and I think this actually kind of perfectly illustrates that, he was probably going to go king h7 after knight e7 check and didn't really fear the move, because now I couldn't play knight e7 check, and king h7 pretty much is obligatory. Note that, I played rook b7, but note that if knight e7, if king h8 was played for some reason, that would actually lead to checkmate, because after rook takes, queen h6 is actually mate. So the king would go to king to h7, but you can see here that there's just no follow-up. The knight is kind of, doesn't have any other pieces to kind of work with. And I have maybe one little tactical try, which is knight takes g6, a point being that you can't take on g6 with the pawn because of the pin, but very simply, black can just play knight takes g6, and that's the end of it. So, anyways, I played the move rook b7, declining the rook trade because I realized that was lost. But this is also lost because, unfortunately, rook a1 check comes in and just, my position just collapses. Now, one thing I do want to point out that's kind of important is you might say, well, why didn't you take on a8 and play queen h6? Because you're threatening mate, and if queen f8, there's knight e7, amazingly, and then the black has to give up the queen, and then there's checkmate anyway. Well, the kind of unfortunate point for me is that in this position after queen h6, there's queen a1 check, and I can't step up to h2 because knight g4 is a deadly fork. And so essentially I was just not in time because my king was too weak. And unfortunately, after my move rook b7, the same is true. My king is just too weak, because after rook a1 check, bishop f1 is already forced. Note that if I go king h2, knight g4 check comes, and the only square is king h3, but now knight e2 is decisive. And the point is that knight g1 is actually mate. So just to illustrate, let's say I make a move like queen g5. Look at that, knight g1. What a beautiful checkmate. The knights are just smothering the white king. So that's pretty much was the problem. So I had to block with the bishop. And unfortunately, after bishop f1, there's knight e2, which is just a really nice tactical shot. And the point is that the queen is hit, I'm pinned, and pretty much no matter where I go, rook takes f1 is a dagger, because then there's a knight takes g3 fork. So I played the move queen f2, knowing full well that the game was over, and Farai very quickly played the move rook takes f1 check. And here I resigned because I'm going to lose my queen after queen f1 and knight takes g3. Really, really tough game to lose, particularly after pretty much after the opening I got. When you get a winning advantage from the opening like that, you really should put your opponent away, because it's so rare that actually happens. But as is the case in a lot of King's Indians, prosecuting your advantage is not the easiest thing in the world. And I think I just suffered from a plethora of too many attractive options, because I spent 30 to 40 minutes in a position on move like, basically on move like 12, and that can come to bite you in a game when there's a lot more chess to be played. And so I played the latter half of the game down 20, 30 minutes on the clock, and basically trying in vain to get off an attack that really never got off the ground, because I spent all this time in the opening. So instead, it would have been much better to go for that exchange sack. I have enduring positional compensation, and I keep a healthy clock time, which was not the case in the game. So yeah, some lessons to be learned. Frustrating to be sure, but hopefully I learned them and would be better in future games. Now, after this loss, I now went back to -2 and wound up finishing the tournament there. And -2 is really a terrible result. It's not a good one at all. But I was proud of the way I fought in the latter half of the tournament, particularly after my start through 6 rounds. To be on pretty much on -3 from 6 rounds, and then to kind of have a decent recovery was something that I thought I would be able to hang my hat on. And starting better in tournaments has to be something of emphasis for me, because a lot of times I think I'm pressing a little bit too early, and then I dig myself into a hole that's tough to get out of. And I think I need to just be a little bit more calm, cool, and collected round in and round out. Anyways, that's it for this tournament and for this game. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.